The nurse Clara adjusted the small camera on the shelf, her hands trembling slightly. She hated doing this, installing a hidden camera in the room of her patient, Mrs. Eleanor, an 82-year-old woman with advanced dementia. But the strange occurrences over the past week had left her no choice. It started with the noises. Every night around 2 a.m., Clara would hear faint whispers coming from Eleanor's room. When she rushed in, she'd find Eleanor sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room, muttering to someone who wasn't there. "He's here again," Eleanor would say, her voice trembling. "The boy. He's waiting for me." Clara had tried to rationalize it. Dementia often caused hallucinations, and Eleanor's mind was slipping further every day. But then came the mirror. One night, Clara found Eleanor standing in front of the antique mirror in her room, her frail hands pressed against the glass. "He's so young," Eleanor whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and longing. "Why won't he speak to me?" Clara had glanced at the mirror, but all she saw was their reflections. Eleanor's pale, wrinkled face and her own worried expression. Still, the incident left her unsettled. The next morning she decided to install the camera. She needed to know what was happening when she wasn't in the room. That night, Clara sat in her small office, staring at the live feed on her laptop. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the hallway. Eleanor was asleep, her chest rising and falling gently. Clara sipped her coffee, her eyes glued to the screen. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., Eleanor stirred. Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. Eleanor sat up slowly, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. She began to whisper, her voice barely audible. Clara turned up the volume, her breath catching in her throat. "I see you," Eleanor murmured. "You've come back." Clara's eyes darted to the corner of the screen, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Eleanor's voice grew louder, more urgent. "Don't leave me again, please. I've waited so long." Suddenly Eleanor stood, her movement surprisingly swift for someone her age. She walked to the mirror and placed her hands on the glass, just as she had before. Clara's stomach churned as she watched. And then it happened. The reflection in the mirror shifted. Clara blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, the reflection wasn't Eleanor's. It was a young man, his face pale and sorrowful, his eyes locked on Eleanor's. Clara gasped, nearly knocking over her coffee. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. But the young man's lips moved as if he were speaking, and Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face. Clara's hands shook as she reached for her phone. She needed to call someone, anyone, but who would believe her? She glanced back at the screen, and her blood ran cold. The young man was gone. Eleanor stood alone, her hands still pressed against the mirror. But now she was smiling. "I'll see you soon," she whispered. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what she'd just witnessed, but one thing was clear. Something was happening in Eleanor's room that defied all logic. And Clara was determined to find out what it was. Clara couldn't sleep that night. The image of the young man in the mirror haunted her thoughts. She replayed the footage over and over, trying to find a logical explanation, a trick of the light, a reflection from outside, anything. But the more she watched, the more convinced she became that what she'd seen was real. The next morning, Clara entered Eleanor's room with a heavy heart. The elderly woman was sitting by the window, staring out at the garden, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked peaceful, almost serene, as if the events of the previous night had never happened. "Good morning, Eleanor," Clara said softly, setting down a tray of breakfast. Eleanor turned to her, her eyes bright but distant. "Good morning, dear. Did you see him too?" Clara froze. "See who?" "The boy," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He visits me every night. He's so kind, so gentle, but he never stays long." Clara's stomach twisted. She knelt beside Eleanor, taking her frail hands in her own. "Eleanor, who is he? Can you tell me more about him?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "He's my son," she whispered. "My sweet boy. He died so long ago, but he's come back to me." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had known Eleanor for over a year, but the elderly woman had never mentioned a son. Was this another hallucination, a product of her deteriorating mind, or was there something more to it? Determined to uncover the truth, Clara decided to search Eleanor's room. She waited until the elderly woman was napping, then began quietly opening drawers and sifting through old photo albums. In the bottom drawer of the dresser, she found a small leather-bound diary. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting delicate and faded. Clara sat on the edge of the bed and began to read. The diary belonged to Eleanor, written decades ago when she was a young woman. The entries were filled with joy and hope, stories of her marriage, her dreams for the future, and the birth of her son, Daniel. Clara's heart ached as she read about Eleanor's love for her child, her pride in his first steps, his first words. But then the tone of the diary changed. One entry, dated just a few months after Daniel's 3rd birthday, was written in a shaky hand. "Today, my world fell apart," Eleanor had written. "Daniel is gone. He wandered off while I was hanging the laundry, and by the time I found him, it was too late. He drowned in the river. My sweet boy. My heart is broken." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She closed the diary, her hands trembling. So Eleanor had lost a son, a tragedy that had haunted her for decades. But how did that explain the young man in the mirror? Was it possible that Eleanor's grief had conjured a ghostly apparition? Or was there something more sinister at play? Clara glanced at Eleanor, who was still sleeping peacefully. She knew she had to dig deeper. But as she stood to leave the room, she noticed something strange. The mirror. It was tilted slightly, as if someone had moved it. Clara walked over and adjusted it, her reflection staring back at her. But for a brief moment, she thought she saw something. A shadow, a flicker of movement. She blinked and it was gone. Shaking off the unease, Clara left the room, the diary tucked under her arm. She had more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Eleanor's past held the key to the mystery, and Clara was determined to uncover it. Clara spent the rest of the morning poring over Eleanor's diary. The entries painted a vivid picture of a woman who had endured unimaginable loss, but had somehow found the strength to carry on. Yet, as Clara read, she noticed something odd. The diary ended abruptly. The final entry was dated just a week after Daniel's death. "I can't go on like this," Eleanor had written. "Everywhere I look, I see him. I hear his laughter, his voice, but he's not there. I don't know how to live without him." There were no more entries after that. Clara wondered what had happened to Eleanor in the years that followed. How had she coped with her grief? And why had she never spoken of Daniel to anyone? Determined to find answers, Clara decided to visit Eleanor's only living relative, her niece, Margaret, who lived in a nearby town. Margaret had visited Eleanor a few times over the years, but Clara had never spoken to her at length. Perhaps she could shed some light on Eleanor's past. That afternoon, Clara drove to Margaret's house, the diary resting on the passenger seat. Margaret greeted her warmly, inviting her inside for tea. "I'm so glad you're taking such good care of Aunt Eleanor," Margaret said as they sat in the cozy living room. "She's always been such a strong woman. But these last few years, well, it's been hard for her." Clara nodded, setting the diary on the table. "I found this in her room. It's from when she was younger. I was hoping you could tell me more about her life back then." Margaret's eyes widened as she picked up the diary. "I haven't seen this in years," she said softly. "Aunt Eleanor used to write in it all the time. But after Daniel died, she changed." Clara leaned forward. "Can you tell me about Daniel? Eleanor mentioned him, but she's never spoken about him in detail." Margaret sighed, her expression somber. "Daniel was her only child. He was such a sweet boy, full of life and curiosity. But one day, he wandered off while Eleanor was busy with chores. By the time she found him, it was too late. He'd fallen into the river and drowned." Clara's heart ached at the thought. That must have been devastating for her. "It was," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "She never really recovered. For years, she blamed herself. She became withdrawn, almost like a ghost herself. Eventually, she moved away, trying to start over. But she never forgot Daniel." Clara hesitated. then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Margaret, have you ever heard Eleanor talk about seeing Daniel? Even now?" Margaret's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Clara explained the strange occurrences in Eleanor's room, the whispers, the mirror, the young man's reflection. Margaret listened in silence, her face pale. When Clara finished, Margaret stood and walked to a nearby bookshelf. She pulled out an old photo album and handed it to Clara. "Look at this," she said. Clara opened the album to find a collection of faded photographs. One picture caught her eye immediately. It was a young Eleanor smiling brightly, holding a little boy in her arms. The boy had curly hair and a mischievous grin. "That's Daniel," Margaret said softly. Clara stared at the photograph, her heart pounding. The boy in the picture looked exactly like the young man she'd seen in the mirror. "Clara," Margaret said, her voice trembling, "I don't know what's happening in Aunt Eleanor's room, but if she's seeing Daniel, it's not just her dementia. That boy, he's been gone for over 50 years. Clara's mind raced. If the young man in the mirror was indeed Daniel, how was he appearing to Eleanor? And why now? As she left Margaret's house, the photograph tucked safely in her bag, Clara knew one thing for certain. The mystery was far from over, and the answers she sought might be more unsettling than she could have imagined. That night, Clara sat in her office, staring at the live feed from Eleanor's room. The photograph of Daniel lay on the desk beside her, his youthful face staring back at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something extraordinary, and perhaps something terrifying. Eleanor was asleep, her breathing slow and steady. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the camera. Clara's eyes were heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. She needed to see what would happen at 2 a.m. The minutes ticked by slowly. Clara's heart pounded as the clock struck 2 o'clock. Eleanor stirred. Clara leaned forward, her eyes glued to the screen. Eleanor sat up in bed, just as she had the night before. Her eyes were fixed on the corner of the room, and she began to whisper. "You're here," Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I knew you'd come back." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She turned up the volume, her hands shaking. "I've missed you so much," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "Why did you leave me?" Clara's eyes darted to the corner of the screen, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Eleanor's face, however, was filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow, as if she were speaking to someone real. Then Eleanor stood. She walked to the mirror, her movements slow but deliberate. Clara's stomach churned as she watched. "I see you," Eleanor whispered, her hands pressing against the glass. "You're so beautiful, just like I remember." Clara's heart raced. She glanced at the mirror on the screen, but all she could see was Eleanor's reflection. And then it happened again. The reflection shifted. Clara's breath hitched as the young man appeared in the mirror, his face pale and sorrowful. He looked exactly like the boy in the photograph, Daniel. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed to record this, to capture proof of what she was seeing. But before she could hit record, something even more startling happened. Daniel's reflection moved. He reached out, his hand pressing against the glass from the other side. Eleanor gasped, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't leave me," she pleaded. "Please, stay with me." Daniel's lips moved, but no sound came out. Eleanor nodded as if she could hear him. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll come with you." Clara's blood ran cold. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She couldn't just sit and watch this. She had to intervene. She rushed to Eleanor's room, her heart pounding. When she opened the door, Eleanor was still standing in front of the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass. "Eleanor," Clara said softly, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" Eleanor turned to her, her eyes filled with tears. "He's here," she said, her voice trembling. "My boy. He's come to take me home." Clara's stomach twisted. She glanced at the mirror, but all she saw was their reflections. "Eleanor, there's no one there," Clara said gently, taking the elderly woman's hand. "Let's sit down, okay?" Eleanor shook her head, her grip tightening on Clara's hand. "No, you don't understand. He's real. He's always been real." Clara's mind raced. She didn't know what to do. Was Eleanor hallucinating? Or was something truly supernatural happening? As she led Eleanor back to bed, the elderly woman's eyes never left the mirror. "I'll see you soon," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange sense of peace. Clara tucked Eleanor into bed, her hands trembling. She stayed by her side until the elderly woman fell asleep, her breathing slow and steady. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The young man in the mirror, Eleanor's unwavering belief in his presence, the way she spoke of going with him. It all pointed to something Clara couldn't explain, and as she left the room she couldn't help but glance at the mirror one last time. For a brief moment she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, a shadowy figure. But when she looked again, it was gone. The next morning Clara woke up feeling exhausted. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of Eleanor and the mysterious young man in the mirror. She needed answers, and she needed them soon. After checking on Eleanor, who was sitting by the window seemingly calm and unaware of the previous night's events, Clara decided to visit the local library. If there was any information about Eleanor's past, or about Daniel, it might be buried in old records or newspapers. The library was quiet, the scent of old books filling the air. Clara approached the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I'm looking for information about a family that lived here about 50 years ago," Clara explained. "The last name was Harper, Eleanor Harper. She had a son named Daniel." The librarian's expression softened. "Oh, the Harpers. That's a sad story. Let me see what I can find." She led Clara to a section of the library filled with old newspapers and microfilm. After a few minutes of searching, she handed Clara a yellowed newspaper from 1973. "This might help," the librarian said gently. Clara's heart sank as she read the headline. "Tragedy strikes local family. 3-year-old boy drowns in river." The article detailed the heartbreaking story of Daniel Harper's death. According to the report, Eleanor had been hanging laundry in the backyard when Daniel wandered off. By the time she realized he was missing, it was too late. His body was found in the river later that day. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she read. The pain Eleanor must have endured was unimaginable. But as she continued reading, something caught her attention. At the end of the article, there was a brief mention of a witness, a neighbor who claimed to have seen a young man near the river that day. The neighbor described him as a tall, pale figure with curly hair, but when questioned by the police, the man had vanished without a trace. Clara's breath hitched. The description matched the young man in the mirror. She quickly scanned the rest of the article, but there was no further mention of the mysterious figure. Still, the mention of a witness sent a chill down her spine. Could it be possible that Daniel's death was connected to this man? And if so, who was he? Clara spent the next few hours digging through more records, but she found nothing else about the witness or the young man. Frustrated but determined, she decided to visit the river where Daniel had drowned. The river was peaceful, the water glistening in the sunlight. Clara stood on the bank, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this place held the key to the mystery. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, weathered cross tucked into the grass near the water's edge. It was old and worn, but Clara could make out the name carved into the wood: Daniel Harper. Her heart ached as she knelt beside the cross. This was where Eleanor had lost her son, where her life had changed forever. And now, decades later, Daniel seemed to be reaching out to her from beyond the grave. But why? Clara didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Eleanor face this alone. Whatever was happening, Clara would be there for her, no matter how strange or unsettling it became. Clara returned to the care facility that evening, her mind still reeling from everything she had learned. The photograph, the diary, the newspaper article, and the cross by the river. All of it pointed to a tragedy that had haunted Eleanor for decades. But the question remained: who was the young man in the mirror, and why was he appearing to Eleanor now? That night, Clara decided to stay in Eleanor's room. She couldn't bear the thought of watching the events unfold on a screen again. She needed to be there to see for herself what was happening. Eleanor seemed calm as Clara helped her get ready for bed. She didn't mention Daniel or the mirror, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes that made Clara uneasy. "You're staying tonight?" Eleanor asked as Clara settled into a chair by the bed. "Yes," Clara said softly. "I thought I'd keep you company." Eleanor smiled, her face serene. "That's kind of you, dear. But you don't have to worry about me. I'm not afraid." Clara's heart ached at the words. She wanted to ask Eleanor what she meant, but the elderly woman closed her eyes, her breathing slowing as she drifted off to sleep. The hours passed slowly. Clara sat in the dimly lit room, her eyes flickering between Eleanor and the mirror. The air felt heavy, almost charged, as if something were about to happen. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., Eleanor stirred. Clara's heart pounded as the elderly woman sat up in bed, her eyes fixed on the corner of the room. She began to whisper, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're here," Eleanor said, her face lighting up with a smile. "I knew you'd come." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She followed Eleanor's gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Eleanor stood, her movements slow but steady. She walked to the mirror, her hands reaching out to touch the glass. "I see you," she whispered, her voice filled with love. "You're so beautiful, just like I remember." Clara's stomach churned as she watched. She wanted to intervene, to pull Eleanor away from the mirror, but something held her back. And then it happened. The reflection shifted. Clara's eyes widened as the young man appeared in the mirror, his face pale and sorrowful. He looked exactly like the boy in the photograph, Daniel. But this time, Clara could see him clearly. He wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. He was there, his hand pressing against the glass from the other side. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I've missed you so much," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm ready to go with you." Clara's heart raced. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Eleanor, no!" she cried, rushing to the elderly woman's side. But Eleanor didn't seem to hear her. Her eyes were locked on the mirror, her hands pressed against the glass. "I'll see you soon," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange sense of peace. Clara's stomach twisted as she glanced at the mirror. The young man's reflection was fading, his hand slipping away from the glass. "No," Clara cried, reaching out to Eleanor. "Don't go." But it was too late. Eleanor's eyes fluttered closed, her body going limp in Clara's arms. "Eleanor!" Clara shouted, her voice filled with panic. She gently lowered the elderly woman to the floor, checking for a pulse. There was none. Clara's heart shattered as she realized what had happened. Eleanor was gone. Tears streamed down Clara's face as she cradled Eleanor's lifeless body. She glanced at the mirror one last time, but the young man's reflection was gone. All she saw was her own tear-streaked face staring back at her. The days that followed were a blur for Clara. Eleanor's passing left a void in the care facility and in Clara's heart. She had grown so close to the elderly woman, and the mystery surrounding her final days only deepened the sense of loss. Clara spent hours going through Eleanor's belongings, searching for any clues that might explain what had happened. In a small box tucked away in the closet, she found a letter addressed to her. With trembling hands, Clara opened the envelope and began to read. "Dear Clara, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You've been more than a nurse. You've been a friend. And I need you to know the truth. My son Daniel has been with me all these years. Not in the way you might think, but in my heart and my memories. Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever endured, but I've always felt his presence. And in these final days I've seen him again. I know it might sound strange, but he's real to me. He's come to take me home. Please don't be sad for me. I'm at peace now. I'll finally be with my boy, and that's all I've ever wanted. Thank you for being there for me, Clara. You've made my final years brighter than I ever thought they could be. Take care of yourself, and remember that love never truly dies. With all my heart, Eleanor." Clara's tears fell onto the letter, blurring the ink. She folded it carefully and held it to her chest, her heart aching with a mix of grief and relief. Eleanor had found peace, and Clara knew she had to let her go. At Eleanor's funeral, Clara stood by the graveside, the photograph of Daniel in her hand. She placed it gently on the casket, a final tribute to the bond between mother and son. As she walked away, Clara felt a strange sense of closure. The mystery of the young man in the mirror might never be fully explained, but she knew one thing for certain. Eleanor's love for Daniel had transcended time and space, and in the end, it had brought her the peace she so desperately needed. Clara took a deep breath, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from her shoulders. She would always remember Eleanor, her strength, her kindness, and the unbreakable bond she shared with her son. And as she stepped into the sunlight, Clara felt a quiet sense of hope. Love, she realized, was the most powerful force of all. It could bridge the gap between life and death, and it could bring light to even the darkest of days.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.